So, Mr. Howard, thank you so much for joining us and being prepared to talk about the financial system and developments over the last 30 plus years. Certainly, you've had a long and distinguished career, and you were Treasurer at the time that the Campbell Committee kicked off its inquiry. Can you tell me a bit about the time that you've seen in terms of inquiries and the development of the financial system, but also, in your view, how frequent should these inquiries occur?
I think these inquiries should occur when they are needed. The idea that you should have routinely an inquiry every given number of years is not necessarily very sensible. The landmark inquiry in the financial system was, of course, the Campbell inquiry, which I established as Treasurer in 1979. And of all the major inquiries into the Australian economy, none has been more comprehensively listened to than Campbell. Many of them, like the Vernon inquiry in the 1960s, just gathered dust on parliamentary library shelves, whereas Campbell was comprehensively implemented. And that was because in time, and I stress in time, both sides of politics came to support its recommendations. When it was set up, I had in mind putting on it a group of people who believed in financial reform. I didn't see any point, as some people advised me to do, to appoint a token regulator, somebody who believed in maintaining tight government control. I thought the best way to get a sensible set of recommendations was to appoint a group of people who believed in reform and change. And that, of course, is what happened.
Certainly with the GFC, we've had a bit of a shakeout, and we've got this current inquiry. What are some of the issues that you think the current inquiry needs to really look at in particular, given all the other previous inquiries, but post the GFC?
My starting point is that our financial system has worked very well. One of the number of reasons why we came through the GFC quite well was that our banks were very sound, well run and sensibly regulated. And our system of regulation stood up very well compared with that of other countries. So my starting point, without in any way preempting what the inquiry might recommend, my starting point is that the current system is good. And we shouldn't be complacent about it, but it is good, and we shouldn't start reinventing the wheel. The fundamentals of the system are really those laid down by Campbell. There have been changes and embellishments along the way, particularly from the Wallis inquiry, which we set up in 1996. But the place of the various regulators that flowed out of Wallis is still there, and whilst I don't want to encroach on the territory of the present government or the present Treasurer, it seems to me that the fundamentals of our regulatory system are good and sound. That doesn't mean to say you don't change anything, but I think it's a mistake to think that we have to start all over again with financial regulation in Australia. We clearly don't.
Your long distinguished career, you've seen a lot of inquiries and no doubt had a lot of impact and in setting the terms of reference. Just in relation to your experience, how are terms of reference established and how does a government manage the policy aspects as well as the political dimension?
Well, the political dimension is something you have to handle and address when you get the inquiry's recommendation. You've got to work out what you can implement and when and how and what you can't do. My experience, and it's based entirely on Campbell, is that you provide terms of reference in a sense that point the inquiry to some degree in the direction that you want. There's no good setting up an inquiry that invites people to recommend something that you're not going to agree with. If people are likely to recommend that, well, you don't have the inquiry in the first place.
As Prime Minister, you commissioned the last inquiry, the Wallis inquiry. It was headed up by a non-banking chair, it's Stan Wallis. What are the characteristics of a chair and a panel that are important in a good inquiry?
Well, you need as chairman of an inquiry a man or a woman who has a good level of common sense, who understands the business community, understands the relationship between the provision of finance and the effective operation of a business. Now, if you have those ingredients, the person doesn't have to be a banker or somebody in the financial community. Keith Campbell was a person with a background in real estate and property, but he had a very good business head. And I used to observe him on a government advisory panel in my early years as a minister, and I was mightily impressed with his grasp of business. And he understood the difficulties of financing business. He understood the relationship between business and finance. And provided you've got that, there's almost an argument for not having somebody out of the financial community to be the chairman.
In terms of the Wallis inquiry, are there any lessons from the Wallis inquiry and the recommendations that you think that the current inquiry needs to be familiar with or aware of?
I think David Murray and his colleagues are well aware of everything that came out of Wallis. I wouldn't seek to give them any guidance on that. I always found David Murray a very savvy banker with a remarkably good understanding of the relationship between the banking industry and the government. And I think he's alive to all of the pitfalls. Did
the Howard government introduce all of the reforms out of the Wallis inquiry that it wanted to, or did you have a number of blockages with the Senate?
I don't think we had too many blockages with the Senate. Most of the things that we wanted to introduce, the changed regulatory arrangements, the emergence of APRA and those other things, I think we were pretty happy. There may have been one or two things that we might have wanted that we weren't able to do, but the main recommendations we were able to implement. And bear in mind that the regulatory framework that carried Australia through the GFC was the regulatory framework put in place following the Wallis inquiry. And even the former Labor government, via the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, acknowledged that we had a gold star regulatory system, and she said that at a meeting in 2009 in Davos. So the two principal reasons we came through the GFC so well are, firstly, as you acknowledge, the strong fiscal position that the Rudd government inherited from my government. When he became Prime Minister, we had no net debt, we had a huge amount of money in the Future Fund. And we had a budget surplus, and that meant almost without parallel anywhere else in the Western world, we entered the GFC in very strong fiscal condition. And that's not just a personal view of mine, it was the view of the Governor of the Reserve Bank only a few months after we left office. I think that's the main reason, but another major reason has to be the fortuitous resource endowment of Australia and China's demand for our resources. We were very lucky that Providence gave us all those resources and that China expanding wanted them. Now, I think they're the two main reasons. My view about the Rudd government's measures in response, I think they were overdone, unnecessary, in many cases extravagant. There were some measures that were justified and I supported, but there was too much money spent. And a lot of the money that was spent on things like pink bats and the like was really wasted and didn't really constitute the major reason why we avoided the bullet of the financial crisis.
Do you think that the response or the rapid response from the Rudd government was because of fear, or do you think it was something that was structural or strategic? Do you think that in some cases people saw the GFC and thought, goodness, this might be another 1929? Do you think that...
I have no doubt that there was an element of fear, apprehension at the time, I'm sure. That, of course, meant that there was an even heavier onus on the government to do sensible things. I accept that some measures were needed, and I accept that the automatic stabilisers of the budget would kick in. That's to be expected, but the occasion did not justify some of those measures of which I've spoken. But fundamentally, we were kept afloat by the two things I mentioned, the strong fiscal position we had when we entered, and also the huge ongoing demand for our resources by the Chinese predominantly, but not only the Chinese, also the Japanese and the Koreans.
I was living in America at the time of the GFC, and it was quite remarkable hearing about which bank might be next in terms of falling over. Certainly we're very fortunate in Australia that our banks are very big and strong and have been well regulated.
They've also been, let's be fair, well run.
Yep.
We should give some credit to the people who ran the banks at the time. It's easy to bang bankers, but we have to remember that we didn't have any of the difficulties that the Americans and the Europeans experienced. Now that has to be due to sensible regulation. It also has to be due to the quality of the leadership of the banks, and also due to the general fiscal environment in which the banking system was operating.
But it goes to the question as well that we were very fortunate, and say the US wasn't as fortunate, anywhere near as fortunate as Australia. But what are your views about moral hazard and the role of the taxpayer in perhaps bailing out industries, or let's say in this case banks? What role, if any, does the taxpayer have if there's a major shock to the banking system and a bank may be in jeopardy of falling over?
You can never lay down an absolute formula for behaviour in relation to that. Having been in government, I accept that until something actually happens and you're in government and the buck has stopped with you, you don't really know precisely how you're going to react, and people shouldn't proclaim absolute purity in relation to these things without understanding that if you're faced with the choice between something going down and there being extensive chaos amongst ordinary people, it's easy to, in theory, to say, oh, well, let it all go down. In practice, it's a lot harder, but it depends a bit on the conditions that are involved. I mean, for example, in the motor car industry in the United States, there was a lot of financial help given to bail out the motor car companies, but a condition of that financial help was that the unions accepted the need for massive structural adjustment in relation to wages and working conditions. So it depends a bit on what accompanies thing. But generally speaking, I'm against governments bailing companies out, and I was very supportive of the decisions taken by the Abbott government in relation to the motor car industry and Qantas and SPC and all of those other things. I generally believe very strongly that government should not bail out companies that have failed.
There's been, you think about sort of the 1997 Asian currency crisis, and I mean, one of the things in the GFC and the subprime even before that, markets globally are increasingly co-integrated and correlated, and certainly, you know, we're so interconnected in today's day and age that any impact in one part of the global economy can have a big impact on other parts. Do you think that the benefits of closer integration globally outweigh the risks that there are to the global economy?
Well, I don't think we have an alternative. We live in a globalised economy, full stop. And it's not going to change. And what we must do is to make sure it operates to the optimum benefit of all of the participants. And the first requirement of any government is to run its own domestic show properly. Because the strength of the world economy, I still believe, is the sum total of the strengths of individual economies. And the bad functioning of aspects of big economies can have a chain reaction. I'm sceptical about how many international agreements can reform the situation. I'm still a great believer that every nation should run its own economy efficiently and prudently. And if one does that, then the sum total of that good quality administration is going to produce a far better world. I mean, after all, when you look back on the financial turmoil that's occurred in the last, on occasion during the last 50 to 100 years, has normally been the result of some domestic failures and bad policy implemented by individual countries. We still live in a world of nation states, and therefore it's up to every single government to run its economy efficiently and effectively.
Do you think there are any gaps in the regulatory architecture that we currently have? I mean, there's the inquiries talking about possibly separating out superannuation to have its own regulator looking after superannuation. Do you think there are any gaps?
I'd like to hear the final report views on that. I don't feel there's a strong need for still more bodies. I always start with the presumption that you don't create more regulatory authorities. Seems to me to be a contradiction in terms for a country or a government that's meant to believe in free markets to keep adding regulatory bodies. A certain level of regulation is needed and a vigorous pursuit of fraud and dishonesty is needed, but the idea that you just regulate for the sake of regulation has never attracted me.
And lastly, just in terms of regulators, I think it was your government that ensured that the RBA was independent of political interference. Do you think that the regulators are sufficiently, financial regulators are sufficiently independent in making their decisions outside of government?
I am sure that the Reserve Bank is very independent. We gave it full independence in relation to the setting of interest rates. It was one of the first things that we did when the new governor, Ian Macfarlane, was appointed in 1996. There was an exchange of letters between him and Peter Costello. And that was a very important reform. And the Reserve Bank certainly exercised that independence to the full.
Competition's an important part of the financial system inquiry terms of reference. Professor Ian Harper's also undertaking a review in competition more broadly across the economy. Australia is a fairly highly concentrated market in terms of, particularly in terms of banking, wealth management. The top 10 fund managers control about 60% of assets. Do you think that Australia can do better in enhancing competition, or do you think there's a strength in having such concentration?
Well, with a country of 23 million people, there's the eternal tension between, on the one hand, sufficient strength and resilience amongst the existing players to provide confidence to consumers and to avoid unexpected collapses against the undesirability of too much concentration. There's always going to be tension at the edges. There's always going to be argument. You see it not only in the financial system, you see it every day in the retail industry, the argument about Coles and Woolworths and so forth. Now, if you listen to one side of the argument, it's very impressive, and that is, why should these two companies or four banks dominate the entire scene? It's very impressive. You listen to that, and then on the other hand, you hear the argument, well, if you're going to have good quality services in a small market and you can't compare 23 million Australians, which is 2 or 3 million shy of the entire population of Texas in the United States, give you an idea of the comparisons, you can't expect to have the same proliferation of players. There's always going to be tension between those two things, and the role of competition policy is to provide background and guidance for that, resolving that tension, but you're never going to finish that argument. No matter what you do, you'll get people complaining about the big fellas, and equally you'll get the supporters of the big fellas saying, well, if they're not big and strong, you could have a collapse. Now, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but it's true.
Professor Fred Hilmer recently warned in a speech, UNSW, that corrupt conduct is perhaps destroying competition as much as things like price fixing. Do you think that corrupt conduct is on the rise in Australia, and what are the implications that there may be for competition?
I'm not really in a position to know whether corrupt conduct is on the rise in Australia. My instinct is that it's probably been there for some time. Whether it's a bit more widespread now because of the, I guess, the facilitation that information technology provides to certain forms of corrupt behaviour, that may be an influence, but I can't really make a declaration on that. I just am not across enough of the material to know.
And in your time as Prime Minister and post being Prime Minister, do you think that the ACCC's got enough in terms of resourcing to actually put downward pressure on prices?
Well, the ACCC and those that support it would always argue it hasn't got enough resources. That always happens. I'm always sympathetic to treasurers when it comes to regulatory bodies asking for more money. I thought my government adequately provided for the regulatory authorities. I'll leave it to others.
Are there any things in the terms of reference for the financial system inquiry that you think are missing?
No, I don't think so. I think both of them are quite. Both of those inquiries, both the one that David Murray is doing, the other one that Ian Harper is doing, are quite comprehensive, and they're both very good men, outstanding. Each of them with a specialty and a background, and I'm sure that you will get from each of them high quality reports. I'm sure you will.
Your long and distinguished career, Prime Minister, Treasurer, post-Prime Minister, what are some of the things that have surprised you most about Australia's financial system over the decades that you've been in public life?
I don't know that I was surprised by it, but I was impressed by the speed with which the Australian financial system adjusted to change. There was an enormous amount of change beginning in the 70s, but it accelerated in the 80s. The financial system adjusted. It absorbed very easily the entry of overseas banks. It easily assimilated the floating of the currency, and I've been impressed with the way in which the system has adjusted. But you never want to get complacent about that. We are still too heavily regulated in many areas, but most of them are not in the financial area. They're really in areas like industrial relations, where we are still far too heavily regulated, and we really do at some stage have to address that issue because we've gone backwards in that area over the last 6.5 years. It's the one area of the Australian economy where, apart from going from surplus into deficit, but that is a macro thing, in the micro management of the economy, the one area where we've really gone backwards is industrial relations.
You're a sports lover like I am, and Australia does punch above its weight. You look at the Olympics or even the recent Commonwealth Games, and Australia's right up there when it comes to a league table. If we look at Australia's financial system globally, where do you think we might sit on a league table?
I couldn't describe a number, but I issue a warning about league tables. Of comparative performance, whether it be financial systems or anything else, that usually the margin between the country that's at the top and the countries that's sitting at number 10 or number 15 is minuscule. And the question really is not so much where you sit on the table, but is whether you have a regulatory system that works and, more importantly, is able to handle a sudden crisis. I don't think there's any doubt that we have a regulatory system that passes both of those tests. It does work, and it did provide stability at the time of the global financial crisis, and whether that means it's 1 or 2 or 10 or 15 is immaterial to me. It worked when it was needed, and it worked far better than the regulatory systems of many other countries.
Well, Mr. Howard, thank you so much for joining us and spending some time. I really appreciate your insights, particularly the historical perspective you've been able to provide, and we really much appreciate sharing your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.